Have you ever taken the last train home, only to feel like something's off? Like reality is slipping through your fingers, and you're stuck in a place where time and space no longer make sense. Imagine sitting on a train, exhausted from a long day, thinking you're heading home, but then, you realize, you're not alone, and yet, you are. Welcome to the last train home. It had been a grueling day for Ethan. The late shift at the office had drained him, leaving him desperate to get home and escape into the comfort of his bed. As he arrived at the quiet train station just before midnight, he noticed that the platform was almost deserted, the usual crowd long gone. He boarded the last train, exhausted and eager to return to normalcy. The doors slid shut behind him with a soft whoosh, and the train pulled out of the station. The train car was eerily silent, lit only by the flickering overhead lights. Ethan settled into an empty seat by the window, leaning his head against the cool glass. His mind wandered, the rhythm of the train lulling him into a state of half-consciousness. But as the minutes ticked by, a subtle unease began to creep up his spine. The car was unnaturally quiet. No one else was on board. He glanced around, squinting to make sure he hadn't missed anything in his sleepy haze. Empty seats, cold metal walls. Ethan shrugged it off at first. Maybe the late hour had something to do with it, or maybe the other passengers were just spread out in the other cars. But then, his phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He pulled it out, intending to check the time, but the screen flickered as it came to life. The familiar train schedule popped up, but as he glanced at it, a chill ran down his spine. The route was wrong. Ethan blinked several times, rechecking the map, but it didn't make sense. The train wasn't following its usual path. He wasn't heading home at all. He squinted, heart pounding, as the map displayed strange, unfamiliar stations, places he didn't recognize. Was he even on the right train? The train gave a sudden, sharp jolt, its wheels screeching against the tracks. Ethan's stomach lurched. This was different. It wasn't the usual swaying motion he'd grown accustomed to. It felt unnatural. As if the train itself was pulling him in the wrong direction. The lights above flickered, adding to the unease that gripped him. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice trembling. He stood up, hoping to find a conductor, someone who could explain what was going on. But the silence was deafening. Where was everyone? Where was the conductor? A strange sound cut through the stillness. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but then louder footsteps, shuffling. From the corner of his eye, Ethan saw movement. He whipped his head around, his breath caught in his throat. There was no one there. Shaking his head, he forced himself to move toward the next car, hoping to find answers. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and he stepped through only to find something far more unsettling. The next car wasn't empty. Shadows lingered in the dim light, their forms vaguely humanoid. Ethan's heart pounded harder as he took slow steps forward, his senses heightened, every instinct screaming at him to run. The figures were not quite right, blurred, like smoke or mist. Their heads were tilted in odd angles, faces hidden. Yet, despite their featureless appearances, Ethan could feel their eyes on him, burning with an intensity that froze him in place. "What's going on here?" Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. A voice soft, almost a whisper, echoed from the corner of the car. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan spun around, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The figure was gone. There was only the suffocating darkness, and the cold, dead air that made him feel like he was suffocating. He stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but when he tried to open the next door, it wouldn't budge. The train kept moving faster, now. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally across the walls. Panic surged through him. He turned back to the door. There was no way out. His phone was dead. Completely useless. "Stop the train!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking as he pounded on the door, but there was no response. Nothing. It wasn't just the train that was wrong, it was everything. The world around him seemed to distort, like it was unraveling, piece by piece. And then, at the far end of the car, he saw it, a figure, tall and distorted, standing in the doorway to the next car. Its outline was sharp, unnatural, almost wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the figure moved closer, gliding through the air. Who are you?" Ethan choked out, his voice trembling in fear. The figure didn't speak. Instead, its long, bony fingers reached out toward him, impossibly long, stretching beyond human capability. "You're not supposed to be here," it rasped, the voice echoing in the cold, empty air. Ethan backed away, panic gripping him as he searched for an escape, but there was none. He was trapped. Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt. The figure vanished, and the silence returned. The doors opened with an eerie hiss, but what greeted Ethan was nothing he could have imagined. The station was empty. Completely empty. The platform stretched endlessly into the fog, a place he didn't recognize. His legs were unsteady as he stepped off the train, but as soon as his foot hit the ground, the train's doors slammed shut, and it sped off into the night, disappearing into the mist. Ethan stood frozen, staring after the train. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Or was he dreaming? Then, he noticed a sign hanging crookedly at the edge of the platform. It was old, faded, the letters barely readable, but he knew. He knew. This station wasn't on any map. It didn't belong here. A voice whispered from the darkness behind him, "You're never going home." Is the last train home just a ride to nowhere? Or is it an escape from something worse? The real question is, if you take the last train tonight, will you be lucky enough to find your way back, or will you, too, be lost forever? Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and keep your eyes peeled, because you never know which train you'll board next.